You know, when I said that the weight loss video is going to be the hardest video to make, that the hardest video that this is much harder for me to talk about. I'm going to talk today about my faith. There's something I've never talked about on camera, I don't think, really before. I'm going to be a little bit tense, I think. I'm doing better with this. I've tried to film this before. I kind of committed to this for a number of I did commit to this for a number of reasons, some personal, some external. But like I really want to open this up because I don't want it to affect me the way that it has for so long. I want to grow, to move past this, and there's no way of doing that without opening up about it. And as this has been such a huge part of my life, this conversation with you for the last 5 or 6 years of my life, 6 years of my life, wow, it's important to talk about it here. I also think it's just important because I think there are a lot of people that are experiencing similar things, have experienced similar things, and have gone through something very similar. And we should talk about it. I also just realized my audio settings are kind of messed up, so give me 1 second. Also, now that I've adjusted the audio settings, Cooper's chewing a bone behind me, and I'm just going to live with it. So if you catch any weird noises, it's not me. I promise, it's not me. If you've read my book, or I don't know, maybe you know me in person, you know that like I actually grew up a pastor's son. I grew up in the church, but the church is a thing that I grew up believing to be a universal, something constant, something global, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But I've come to realize in my worldly travels, it's not a remotely universal experience. So to give you a little bit more context, the church that I grew up in was in an evangelical American Christian church, not nearly as fundamentalist or crazy as those words probably bring to a number of your minds, but definitely in that genre, and very closely related to a lot of that, actually, in the very near even geographic vicinity and some of the overlap that we had with the churches around us as I was growing up. It's really important to kind of dive into some of what I believed, because what this is ultimately a video about for me is walking away from a structure that was what my entire life was poured into as a kid. Okay, I can't actually ignore this. Okay. I think the most important thing probably to say out of the gate is growing up, like I actually loved going to church. There are two kind of camps of pastors' kids that I think most people think about. The like crazy rebellious pastor's kid that everybody's like, oh, there goes the pastor's kid. Or the like good religious, like upright pastor's kid. Where I was like, oh, well, like that kid, yeah, okay, maybe. I kind of fit more into that side of things, into that end of the spectrum growing up, and I wanted to. It was a huge part of my identity. I loved it. The structure that it gave me. Part of the reason I loved going to church so much was because it was full of college kids. I grew up in a small university town. The university was like, you know, central to everything. And my dad's church was actually located on campus, like in a university building. We had services in the student union building of all places. So it was all kids, all college kids. And they were so big and cool and like awesome. I just loved it. Although by the time I got to high school, I think I struggled with that a little bit more, but I'll save that for like a podcast episode. We can talk about this in more depth elsewhere. I thought today I would talk about 3 beliefs that I had growing up and into college especially that later really disintegrated over time. And because of that disintegration, I lost a foundational element of who I was. And it's something I've been reckoning with for the last decade. And I think that I'm finally coming to a place where I'm starting to understand the core elements of what made that so raw and so difficult for me, what actually really challenged me in that and made this such a painful experience. And it also means that it's time to open up more about it. I don't know how much I'm going to talk about it on my channel here. Probably not much. This might be the only video that I make about it, especially because I'm in a period of like kind of transitioning how I go about doing YouTube, but it is something that I'll engage with more for sure on my podcast, Garage Monologues. The newest episode will go up on Patreon here soon. And something that I think is really important just for me personally to really be diving into, because it's a huge element of who I am that I've really done my best to avoid and ignore for a long time. I could talk about this for hours, literal hours, and there's so many emotions tied up in it. There's so much going on. So just pick 3 things that I think are really foundational to the whole conversation of why ultimately I left the church and everything really changed for me. The first was that the church was something special and that it was a key element in the redemption of the world and redeeming people. The second, ironically something that comes before that, was that God was knowable and that the truth was absolute. And the third, built on those 2 things, really, the church community that I was a part of and the knowable God that I thought I knew so well, meant that I knew what it meant to be good, how to be good, and that I was ultimately a good and righteous person. I really grew up with this belief that the church itself was full of special people. Not that they were like somehow superhuman or anything, but the theology behind it was very much that we're all broken, we're all imperfect, we're all fallible, fallen people. But I also believed in this supernatural force that was out in the universe that had created us, that was redeeming us to itself, and that was recreating us, that was redeeming us, that was making us special. I really thought that there was actually something powerful happening and that we were going to grow and become something new and different and separated. And I honestly thought that, yeah, like this group of people, like together we can save the world. I also believed that God was knowable and that I could have a personal relationship with him. The foundational element to the church being something special and redeeming the world was that we as individuals were actually able to commune with God, able to be imbued with his spirit, that we would be changed and transformed, that we would grow as a result of this, that it would be something life-altering, not just for us, but for the people around us. I really bought into that. I dove in headfirst into theology especially. And it's been interesting to talked to my dad about this a little bit recently, like the community around us as men in particular, and the pastors that my dad was associated with for a time that he distanced himself from pretty early on in my life, but how the ripple effects of those people continued into our family, into our lives. They were the types of guys that never admitted fault, that never admitted that they were struggling with anything, that couldn't come together and support each other because they were fine. They were perfect. They had no problems. So if you had problems, well, are you sure you should even be a pastor? Should you even be leading people? That's the kind of community that my dad found himself surrounded by and exited, thankfully, wisely. But it's very helpful and instructive to understand that as an element of how I was raised, because what's instructive in how I picked up on this by osmosis, but also just by direct inference, not only in that group, but in many groups that I found myself involved in over time, was the intellectualization of everything, like the ability to think through everything, to know everything, to rationalize everything. And the rational brain really doesn't operate well with mystery. It doesn't handle love or suffering very well. And these are the things that I would ultimately end up rebelling against in my brain later. But they were really, really helpful tools in trying to navigate the world. And I really believed that I could know the answers to pretty much everything. Which brings me to that third point. I knew how to be good, and I knew that I was righteous. Like, in knowing all these things and having the right answers, in having the correct beliefs, I thought that I'd figured it out. I would tell you like, oh, well, it's not because of me, and it's by the grace of God that I'm saved, if I'm saved. And then you can't ask that question. You can't put the if in there. So you have to go back to like, no, I am. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance in my brain that I'd never recognized until later, but that knowledge that I knew how to be good and I was good, there was a lot going on there where, because I read the Bible front to back multiple times, memorized huge chunks of it, led Bible studies, knew all the answers, knew all the right things to say, had the rituals to walk through. That assured me that I was right, that I knew I was on the right path and that everything was going to be fine. And that separated me from the people that didn't know, and that put me in a position to either teach them or kind of look down upon them from a distance. My self-righteousness was something that I didn't really come to realize was a thing until my mid-20s, but was a thing for sure. And even though I was a really, I think, generally likable and enjoyable person, hopefully, I think a lot of people liked me. I don't think anybody would have necessarily described me as self-righteous. I think that was kind of the more nefarious part, that underneath, I certainly was, oh boy, yeah, pretty self-righteous. And then the wheels started coming off. Part of it was the cognitive dissonance. Part of it was looking at how I thought I knew everything, how I really thought I had the world pinned down, and having some very good friends across a variety of spectrums question those beliefs. Like, it wasn't just the religious side. It was like how I saw the world politically, or how I fit into it, how I saw America, how I saw all these things that started to be questioned. And the more I questioned all these things I took as certain, the harder it was to hold it all together. But what really stood out to me in all of this was ultimately how the failings, oh man, there's so much in here. It's actually really hard to distill this down. It's all very interwoven. A big part of it was how ultimately, like, the church proved itself to be not only just kind of the same as everywhere else. The people were just people, and very few people actually shared the same level of conviction or, intensity for all of this that I did, which is just a natural disappointment that I kind of had over time anyways. But I had this really amazing experience with the church, like my church going experience all the way through college, because it was such a communal thing. There was a lot of energy, and I found a real sense of community in it. And when I left after college, being really involved in a collegiate ministry that was really vibrant, and then a church that I thought was pretty cool, I went abroad and I lived in Nice. And the two churches that I was involved with, one through my roommate and one by choice through a church planting organization that my church back in the States was associated with, I just saw a lot of real unhealth, like some really unhealthy things, and infighting, and basically the complete implosion of one of those churches. That was the first time I'd seen that up close. And then I went back to the States, and the church that I'd been involved with in college, they just fell just short of everything for me over time. I really involved myself. I tried to be as engaged and present as possible, and it was just hollow. It didn't have the same spine as it had when I was involved in the community in college that I was a part of. And then afterwards, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced something similar, but they weren't there for me. I really needed so much from this community. I really was in dire straits, and I felt like I was put out to pasture. There's some really specific and pretty dark stories that I could share. Maybe I'll share that on the podcast to illustrate the point. But there were a lot of things that were said to me, and there were a lot of ways that people really actually directly didn't come through for me that highlighted that this was not necessarily a safe or helpful or healthy place. But I struggled to understand that because in growing up, I loved going to church so much. I actually remember sitting in the driveway, calling my dad after church one Sunday, crying because I didn't want to go. It was the first time in my life I actually didn't want to go to church. They gave us the choice when we were 10 years old, whether or not we wanted to go. My parents were like, hey, once you turn 10, you can choose. You don't have to come with us if you don't want to. But I'd always just felt like I was missing out. I always wanted to go. And then fast forward to when I was, 22 or 23, and I was sitting there crying. It was raining on my maroon Honda Accord, my 1990 Honda Accord. And I was just sitting there on the phone with my dad, just weeping because I was so distraught that something so foundational in my life felt so alien to me now. And I actually didn't want to go back. I ended up going to West Africa with an organization that was a Christian organization. And this got hammered home for me even more because on the ship, it was a hospital ship, not to get into too many details, I guess now, but it was a volunteer organization. I volunteered, I raised support to go. That whole experience revealed a lot to me, but we're here to save people's lives or to provide medical attention. Even if it's not necessarily life-saving, it's going to be life-altering. And people just cannot agree on the most basic things about can you drink or can't you drink alcohol? If you can drink, how much can you drink? When and where can you drink? Can women wear skirts? If so, how long should that skirt be? We're going to have entire meetings about this and discuss what we've decided for now, and no one will agree with anything we've decided. There was just this strange pettiness and this lack of universality, this lack of an actual conception of truth. What matters here? What is true and isn't true? And why are we fighting on things that are clearly just cultural differences, have nothing to do with anything deeper that matters? And I really struggled with that a lot. I learned a lot and I grew a lot, and that's a whole nother conversation as well. And it highlighted for me that this group of people that we call the church, that is a body of believers and so forth, may not be that much different from each other after all. We might all be kind of the same as everyone else. And the people that were more ardent in their belief, the people that were more like me, I felt like were more likely to be kind of shitty. And the people that didn't believe in anything often were really nice. And it flipped things in my head. I really didn't know what to do with that. And so when I came back from the ship, when I spent some time in the States, I was just angry. I was so angry, and I felt ashamed and embarrassed. And I've only recently started coming to realize that this was an immaturity, both in faith. I'm not, at this point, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a Christian. I wouldn't say that I'm not. I would say that I'm agnostic at this point. Like, I find some depth and beauty and truth in the scriptures that I once studied so much, but I've also found so much in the other religions and faiths of the world. I think that their truth is truth wherever you find it. And I think that we as humans are mysteries unto ourselves. How can we possibly even begin to claim to know a universal being that created us? I can hardly even, I'm just only getting to understand parts of who I am. All that to say is that, like, I have been going through this massive change, which I think a lot of people have. It's an institution among many institutions that I have ceased to believe in, because so many of the institutions that we were raised with were designed for a time that no longer exists. And so much of what was handed to us just simply can't really function in the world that we live in today. And that's, again, not to say that, like, there aren't foundational elements of it that are good and true and right. And that's not to say that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I just am not sure where the bathwater and the baby boundaries are. I haven't figured out how to get the baby out of the bathwater maybe yet. I don't know how that analogy works, but I've been on a very long, very angry, very sad, very embarrassed, very shameful journey. I've felt a very deep level of shame for my own arrogance and my own pride, and for the people that I'm sure that I hurt along the way, whether or not any of us were aware of it. I'm sure there are people that were aware of it, and I'm really sorry to those people. I said things in my arrogance and in my youth, but that's not an excuse. I have had to come to grips with a lot of this stuff, and it's why I've never really approached this on video. It's not because I don't want to talk about it, and it's not because this is a huge part of who I am, and I've promised to be just my authentic self as transparently as I can be, right, through my vlog and so forth. But I've never approached this because I didn't know how to, and I didn't know how to deal with these incongruencies in myself, both the anger and the hurt at being so incredibly let down and misled by the people that raised me, both in a cultural sense, in a community sense, in a societal sense, in my family. I didn't know what to do with that, but I also don't have answers. And it's taken me until now to actually be okay with that. Like, I don't have the answers, and that's fine. And I don't need to, and I don't plan on having answers for you. But it's taken me a while to get to the point where I've realized, the need for answers and the need to be able to say, hey, I didn't have the answers, but now I do, is an immature part of myself that I'm happy to let die. It's just taken a while for it to wither away. Anyways, I'll dive into this. I can give you like the actual like kind of storyline element of it on my podcast, garagemonologues.com, if you want to see the public version, or go to patreon.com/Jay Swanson. Sign up right now. You'll get this topic will come up in another week after my guest episode with the one and only Nathaniel Drew. Either way, you can wait until the next season rolls out, and it'll come out in the public feed for free if you'd rather not pay for it. But thank you to my patrons for being so supportive through all this. A number of them have figured it out, and we've had some conversations about it. I don't know how to approach this, and maybe just on the podcast is the right way to do it. But there's so many people that are struggling with the institutional shift in our culture, in our civilization right now. There's so many things that are just not living up to the promises that were made. And I think a lot of us are struggling with that and trying to figure out, how do we build whatever comes next? That's something I've been really scared to engage with, because I built something already, or I thought I did. I took something that was pre-built for me and inhabited it. Now that that's crumbled around me, I'm having a hard time trusting that I can build something that will do better. But I do believe not only can I, but I have to, because I can't go about just not really believing in anything for the rest of my life. And I also can't go continually isolating myself from other people on these fronts out of fear, because that is no way to build a future. And there's no way to build a future for myself or for anyone around me. Where I come from a place where I arrogantly thought I was going to be a part of the team that saved the world. Understandably, I'm a little bit scared to step out and try to save anything, but I do want to find a good way to quote Smoochie the Rhino, you may not be able to change the world, but you sure can make a dent. So how do we make a dent together in a way that's good and healthy and leaves us all not scarred emotionally and spiritually afterwards. That's the biggest part. I just don't want to scar anyone else. I walked out very scarred. I have some wounds I'm working through. I want to make sure not to inflict any wounds on anyone going forward. So anyways, that's a fun note to leave things on. Thanks for watching. Go patreon.com/Jay Swanson. I'll talk a little bit more about this over there. And if you just want to support my channel in general, that's the best way to do it. Thanks for watching. And thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this and video.